On today's show, the Milwaukee Bucks limping to the finish line. Why have the Bucks struggled so much under new head coach Doc Rivers? What's the latest on Giannis Antetokounmpo's injury recovery timeline? And are the Pacers a bad draw for the Bucks given the 4-1 season series advantage that Indiana has over Milwaukee this year? It's all coming up on today's Locked On NBA.
You are Locked On NBA, your daily NBA podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On NBA, the biggest stories with the local experts. I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, also host of Locked On Rockets right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Now, today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 3 million members. They are the easiest and most exciting way to get in on the action while you watch your favorite sports and players. You just pick more or less on 2 or more players' stats and watch the winnings roll in. Prize Picks is so simple to play. You can make your picks and submit an entry in less than 60 seconds. They've got quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of different players and stat types, which is what makes Prize Picks the #1 DFS app on the market. And right now, the regular season may be over, but you can still get in on the playoff action and win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks as you and the world's best players take the game to a new level during the NBA postseason. So if you've been thinking about getting in on some daily fantasy sports action, you've got to try Prize Picks. Go download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, download the app and use code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. And joining us now is the host of Locked On Bucks, Justin Garcia, who you can track down wherever you listen to your podcasts and on YouTube. Just search Locked On Bucks. And Justin, unfortunately for Milwaukee, kind of limping to the finish line here a little bit to round out the regular season, just 3-7 over their last 10 games. Now a 17-19 record with Doc Rivers as the head coach. So I want to start right there. Justin, what's the biggest reason, your biggest takeaway for kind of this sub 500 play that Milwaukee has had since Doc Rivers took over as head coach?
Well, I guess the easiest would be injuries and health. And this group just hasn't had it since Doc Rivers took over. They were very fortunate in the first half of the season. And I think it's very easy and unfair to everyone involved to point to, hey, they were 30-13 under Adrian Griffin, and now they've done this under Doc Rivers because of a couple of things. Number one, they played one of the easiest schedules in the league under Adrian Griffin, and even those wins, they weren't coming with style points. They were struggling to beat some of the worst teams in the league. You think to a weekend in Detroit where it took everything in the Bucks to take 2 games from the Pistons. They were also healthy under Adrian Griffin, that some of these issues we pointed to wasn't the case. So the big changes since Doc Rivers took over where they haven't had the health luck that they had in the first half of the season. Chris Middleton missed 16 games. Now the big one is Giannis and worrying or wondering to see what the status is of him. Damian Lillard missed a couple of games as well. Brooke Lopez did. But they played one of the more difficult schedules in the league, and that really started from the moment Doc Rivers took over at the start of a 5-game road trip.
So at this point, kind of providing some of the context for the record under Doc, at least to this point, does this team feel like they're in a better spot with Doc Rivers at the helm than with Adrian Griffin, at least as we're going into the postseason now?
I think overall, yes. If you're just looking at the immediate results and most recent, then it's hard to say yes, that they're in a better spot because of the way they closed out the month. And the month of April was the first losing record in a month that the Bucks had all season long. So they had one month where they were 500. Every other month they had a winning record, not going into the playoffs on the strongest foot. But again, the Giannis injury has some to do with that. Chris Middleton missed a couple of back-to-backs in there as well. But overall, I do think they're in a better spot because those games and those 43 games, the 30 wins were on talent alone, essentially. And when Doc Rivers came in, he cleaned some things up. He hasn't really installed a lot, and I think it's going to be curious to see what they put in this week because Doc Rivers has pointed to, this is basically going to be like a training camp for us, that we get a full week and we know who the opponent is. We can start preparing immediately. We can start to install some other things. rather than just putting in one or two small wrinkles. The big thing Doc has done is just come in and eliminated things and said, okay, why were you guys doing this? You don't do that, you don't do that, and you don't do that. And I think we saw the defense early on, one of the best in the league. It finished in the middle of the pack under Doc Rivers, which should be good enough if this offense is elite. It just hasn't been in those 30-plus games under Doc. And again, injuries are a big reason for that.
Mentioned it a couple times here, but obviously one of the big factors here at the tail end of the season for the Bucks was losing Giannis. At least where are we at with him? What's his timetable looking like for return? What's the optimism surrounding his potential return to make it back in time for, at least some of this first round series against the Pacers?
We really don't know. Doc Rivers has maintained he is optimistic that they will have Giannis in the playoffs. He has not gone as far as saying at the start of the playoffs. He has had some follow-ups on that, and it's just said, I'm optimistic. I'm as optimistic as I can be. And said before the game today, too, when he was asked again about Giannis' status, that he remains optimistic, but, maybe that's just because there's pieces to this he doesn't know. He's not the one experiencing the injury. I think, the danger of listening to outsiders and comping injuries is injuries are different for everyone, and everyone's body is different. It's easy to point to, hey, this happened. Worst case scenario, something similar to Kevin Durant, and he ended up rupturing his Achilles and missing the following season. Would obviously be a disaster scenario for the Bucks. You can point to the opposite end and say, well, Luka Doncic has had this a couple of times and has missed, 2 weeks, somewhere around there. If it is a 2-week timetable, then it may only be one game that Giannis misses, with the Bucks playing Sunday. I think a lot of Bucks fans are of the mindset that this guy is a freak of nature. He's a fast healer, and we had the same reasons for concern in 2021, and Giannis rushed back and played in the finals. The danger there is sometimes that runs out, and you can't keep leaning on that. I get the feeling he's going to miss at least a couple of games, and I think that was the big part of where the Bucks finished, is not to take anything away from the Indiana Pacers, but you can, or at least should feel like, if you don't have Giannis for the duration of the series and he comes back at the midpoint, you still have Damian Lillard. You still have Chris Middleton. You should have enough to beat that team. I think the real danger the Bucks were facing was not having Giannis for part or all of that first round series, and suddenly having to match up with a resurgent Philadelphia 76ers team who, the Bucks faced it last year when we all said, well, the Miami Heat weren't really an 8 seed. 76ers are not really a 7 or 8 seed. They were third at the time that Joel Embiid went out. So this year, more than any other year with this play-in tournament, it's really presented those challenges.
Yeah, it's kind of bittersweet, right? The Knicks win the 2 seed out east, and then suddenly your reward is you get to deal with the Miami Heat or the 76ers, kind of pick your poison there. And we do have, I guess, precedent for Giannis making a quick turnaround, a quick return from what looked like a gruesome injury back when it did happen during the original title run. Now, when you look at the upcoming first round matchup against the Pacers, this is not a matchup that was very friendly to the Bucks throughout the regular season. Pacers 4-1 in the season series. But that comes with, and that includes the going all the way back to the IST, the in-season tournament, as well as the game back in December with the issue with the career high 64 points, the game ball debacle, that whole thing, all the drama, going on surrounding that one. But walk me through, Justin, why this Pacers team caused so many problems for Milwaukee this season.
Well, I think first you have to level set that these are two very different teams from the last time they faced.
Different. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And, the last time they played was January 3rd. That's when all 5 of their games were played at that date or earlier. And just so much has changed with both of those teams. To go back then, this Bucks team, there wasn't really a structure defensively. And I think there was a lot of uncertainty of what they were actually doing. That, I would talk with a couple of beat writers too during games of, man, what is the plan here? Where some guys would be crashing boards, some guys wouldn't, some guys would get back in transition, some wouldn't, that there just wasn't this uniform approach. And I think the Pacers, more than any other team, really took advantage of that. We saw a lot of teams take advantage of that, but really Indy and the pace that they played at did. The Bucks are an older, slower team as well. Indiana is not. So that was a massive advantage that they were just running on the Bucks. There was a lot of confusion, especially defensively, from the Bucks. And a couple of those games, too, the Bucks did not have all of their personnel. So it's two very different teams. Doc Rivers obviously was not the coach for any 5 of those games. And for the Bucks, we've seen some of those changes where Doc has really embraced we don't have to try to play fast. We're an older team. Let's play at our pace. He's really made a point of emphasis to try to get Damian Lillard and Giannis going. That wasn't so much the case in those first few games. You mentioned the Giannis 64-point game. That was about it. The Bucks were really leaning on Giannis throughout the whole series. Those first 3 games, Giannis was averaging 50 points a game against the Pacers. So it was just really a one-man wrecking crew. So I think there's more identity. They know who they are. They know how they have to play even more now than they did before. Pat Beverly helps some too when we talk about fixing some of the issues on the perimeter. He doesn't solve everything, but that helps you to at least have somebody to throw out there at Tyrese Halliburton. And the other part is, in terms of Indiana, they're not the same team either. That Tyrese Halliburton, I know he's played much better of late. He has not looked like the same guy as he was in all 5 of those matchups after the hamstring injury. Obviously, Benedict Mathurin is out for the season. He had some big games against the Bucks. You traded Buddy Hield to the Sixers. Now, none of those games included Pascal Siakam either, but Giannis has had a pretty long track record, especially in the postseason, of success against Pascal Siakam. So they're 2 very different teams, but to me, it really just boils down to more of an identity, more of this team knowing how they have to play. And again, if you're the Bucks, avoiding what could have been a potential disaster scenario. You're more comfortable taking your chances with the Pacers, even if you lost 4 out of 5 of those games, than you are against Nick Nurse, who has diagrammed some pretty successful defenses against Giannis and a returning Joel Embiid.
How will Milwaukee ultimately look against Indiana here in the first round of the playoffs? When will Giannis ultimately make his return to the court and get back in action? You're going to have us covered for all of that and so much more over at Locked On Bucks. Justin, thanks for stopping by Locked On NBA with me.
Anytime.